Welcome back to the Alibi Club, where every mystery is a case file waiting to be reopened. What if an entire community simply vanished, leaving behind no bodies, no graves, no signs of struggle, only a single word carved into a post? That is the story of Roanoke, the colony that disappeared into history. In 1587, over 100 men, women and children set sail across the Atlantic to begin a new life on the edge of an untamed world. They built homes, planted crops, and dreamed of futures that might outlast the wilderness. And then, they were gone. No one knows if they were slaughtered, starved, or quietly absorbed into the lives of others. What we do know is this: the mystery of Roanoke has haunted America for more than 4 centuries, and tonight, you'll hear the story as if you were standing among them. In the late 16th century, Europe was not only obsessed with empire, it was addicted to it. Spain had grown fat and powerful from its New World conquests, pouring gold and silver across the Atlantic to fill its coffers and fund its armies. England, still licking its wounds from years of internal struggle, wanted its share. A colony across the sea was more than just a settlement. It was a promise of glory, wealth, and influence. It was the chance to match Spain, to break free from the shadow of Catholic power, and to stake a flag in the future. For men like Sir Walter Raleigh, the New World offered opportunity beyond imagining. Queen Elizabeth herself granted Raleigh a charter to establish a colony in North America, a move that would prove both bold and reckless. The contract was simple in principle, impossible in execution: establish a settlement, claim territory for England, and ensure the colony thrived within 7 years, or forfeit the right entirely. The pressure was immense. Raleigh, whose own reputation and fortune were bound to the venture, poured resources into outfitting ships and recruiting colonists, and he did so with a vision that reached beyond mere survival. He imagined a settlement that would become England's stronghold on the Atlantic coast, a rival to Spain's sprawling empire. The colonists themselves were a mixture of motives. Some were dreamers, lured by promises of land, riches, and the chance to escape the rigid hierarchies of English society. Others were craftsmen and farmers, needed to build and sustain a functioning settlement. Still others were soldiers, hired to defend the fragile community against potential threats from both European rivals and the indigenous nations whose land they now intruded upon. What united them was not so much a shared vision, but a shared gamble to leave behind the known world in exchange for something uncertain, perhaps even unknowable. The journey across the Atlantic was itself a trial. Weeks of cramped quarters, stale rations, and unpredictable storms tested the patience and endurance of the settlers before they ever glimpsed the shores of Virginia. To many, the sight of the New World must have been both awe-inspiring and terrifying. Endless forests stretching beyond imagination, coastlines untouched by English hands, rivers that promised abundance but hid dangers. It was a land of possibility, but also a land that refused to reveal its secrets easily. From the moment Raleigh's men first set foot on Roanoke Island, they knew this would be no simple enterprise. The soil was sandy, difficult for crops, supplies brought from England were limited, and resupply would be delayed by weather, politics, or outright neglect. The neighboring indigenous tribes, particularly the Algonquian-speaking peoples, were at first cautious but far from trusting. This was their land, their hunting grounds, and the English, strange in dress, speech, and custom, were at best intruders, at worst invaders. And yet, despite all these challenges, the dream persisted. Think of the men standing on the beach at Roanoke, staring out at the Atlantic as their ships disappeared over the horizon. There would be no easy way back, no messenger to call home, no lifeline should they falter. They were at the edge of the world, and only by their own efforts could they hope to carve a place here. It is easy, centuries later, to reduce them to footnotes in history, to treat Roanoke as little more than a riddle to be solved. But these were living people, mothers who comforted their children in the night, fathers who sharpened tools by firelight, farmers who prayed the soil would yield something before winter came. They carried with them the weight of hopes not only their own but of an entire nation desperate to prove itself. Their dream was fragile, but it was not without courage. The first attempts at settlement faltered quickly, and not all would live to see the colony's rebirth. Ill-prepared expeditions, hostile encounters, and poor leadership conspired against them. Each setback threatened not only the colony, but Raleigh's standing at court, yet he pressed on, insisting that England's foothold in the New World could not be abandoned. To admit defeat would be to admit weakness before Spain, to surrender the dream of empire before it had truly begun. And so, the dream hardened into determination. Colonists returned, some unwillingly, some with renewed hope. The failures of the past did not erase the promise of the future. What they imagined, perhaps naively, perhaps with reckless faith, was that Roanoke would someday be remembered as the birthplace of English America, a starting point for generations to come. But history, as it often does, would have other plans. The story of Roanoke was never going to be a simple tale of triumph. It was a story where ambition collided with reality, where human will met the stubborn resistance of the unknown. In many ways, the dream of a new world was less about the colonists themselves and more about the idea they embodied. They were symbols of England's hunger, its fear of being left behind, and its desire to matter in a world reshaped by conquest and discovery. As you listen to their story unfold, remember this: the colonists did not know they were stepping into legend. They only knew they were stepping into danger, clinging to the belief that dreams could outweigh despair. That belief, more than anything, carried them across the sea and into history. And it was that belief, tragically, that history would consume. When Sir Walter Raleigh's charter was granted in 1584, the idea of planting a colony in the New World was more vision than plan. That first reconnaissance voyage was little more than a scouting mission. 2 ships, captained by Philip Amadas and Arthur Barlow, sent to survey the land and return with reports. They came back with glowing descriptions: fertile soil, friendly natives, game in abundance, and a coastline perfect for harbours. Raleigh's men described Roanoke Island as a paradise waiting to be claimed, its people open to trade, its resources unending. What they did not say, perhaps because they did not yet know, was how fragile that goodwill could be, or how difficult survival would prove when fantasy met reality. Encouraged by these reports, Raleigh pressed forward. The next expedition, in 1585, was far more ambitious. 7 ships carried more than 100 men, including soldiers, artisans and scientists, commanded by Sir Richard Grenville, and left in the hands of Ralph Lane once Grenville returned to England. The plan was simple: establish a fortified outpost, build alliances with the local tribes, and use the colony as a base for further exploration. But almost immediately, cracks began to show. Lane and his men were not settlers in the true sense. They were soldiers, adventurers, and opportunists. They came with more weapons than farming tools, more pride than patience. Survival depended on diplomacy and cooperation with the Algonquian tribes, led by Chief Wingina. At first, relations seemed promising. The English traded for food and learned to navigate the waterways with the help of native guides. But mistrust soon festered. Lane demanded too much, too quickly. The colonists expected a steady supply of food from the tribes, forgetting or ignoring that they themselves had limited resources and were bound by their own cycles of scarcity. By the winter of 1585-1586, the settlement was in crisis. The sandy soil produced little, supplies from England had dwindled, and Wingina grew wary of the colonists' constant demands. Tensions boiled over when English soldiers, convinced the natives were withholding food, launched preemptive raids. The fragile alliance shattered. Violence became inevitable. In a brutal escalation, Lane ordered a surprise attack that resulted in the death of Wingina himself, cutting off what remained of trust and sealing the colony's fate. The men at Roanoke were now isolated and starving. Their dreams of exploration and glory had narrowed to a single question: how to survive until help arrived. And yet, across the Atlantic, Raleigh was already boasting of his colonial triumph, unaware, or perhaps unwilling to admit, that disaster was brewing. Help did arrive, though not in the way they expected. In June 1586, none other than Sir Francis Drake appeared off the coast with a fleet fresh from raiding Spanish possessions in the Caribbean. Drake, ever the opportunist, offered supplies and reinforcements, but the settlers were broken in spirit. They chose instead to abandon the colony and return to England. When they boarded Drake's ships, the first Roanoke settlement was left behind, forts half-built, dreams half-broken, and a bitter taste of failure clinging to their memories. Ironically, not long after they departed, Grenville returned with fresh supplies and reinforcements. Finding the colony deserted, he left behind a token garrison of 15 men to maintain England's claim. Those men too would vanish into the wilderness, their fate unknown. Whether they starved, fled, or were killed by hostile tribes, remains one of the smaller mysteries orbiting the greater enigma of Roanoke. But what mattered most in this first attempt was the lesson it should have taught Raleigh and his backers. Colonization was not a matter of planting a flag and waiting for prosperity. It was an endurance test. It required patience, humility, and above all, cooperation with the people who already lived there. Instead, The English brought arrogance and hunger, and in return, they found only ruin. Still, the failure did not stop Raleigh. He was too invested, financially, politically, and personally. The Queen's Charter demanded results, and Raleigh's reputation demanded redemption. He spun the disaster as a temporary setback, a learning opportunity. Next time, he promised, the colony would not be a military outpost of restless soldiers, but a true settlement of families, craftsmen, and farmers. Next time, they would build a community that could sustain itself, that would thrive in the face of hardship. That next time was 1587. It was not just another expedition, it was the birth of the colony that would vanish into history. Picture it. The ghosts of the first colony still lingered in the minds of those who followed. They knew of the hunger, the violence, the abandonment. They knew the land could not be trusted, nor could the sea, and yet, they came. They came with wives, children, and possessions packed into ships, determined that this time would be different. The failure of 1585 did not close the story of Roanoke. It set the stage for the story to come. It showed just how high the stakes were, how thin the line between survival and disappearance could be. More than that, it taught us something timeless about human ambition, that it is often blind, often reckless, and yet relentless. When the second colony set sail, they carried not just their supplies, but the burden of the first colony's mistakes, a burden that would prove heavier than they ever imagined. By 1587, Roanoke was no longer imagined as a temporary foothold. This time, the plan was permanence. Instead of a garrison of restless soldiers, Raleigh authorized an expedition of over 100 men, women, and children. Their leader, John White, an artist and surveyor, who had traveled on earlier voyages. White was not a warrior, not a soldier by trade. He was chosen because he represented something different, the possibility of a true settlement, built on homes and families, rather than forts and battles. The ships left England with high hopes. The colonists brought livestock, seeds, tools, and everything they thought they might need to create a life from the wilderness. They dreamed of streets, of fields, of futures where their children would grow up speaking English under the broad skies of America. For the first time, it was not just an outpost, it was a society in the making. But fate rarely followed the maps they drew. The expedition was originally meant to establish a settlement at Chesapeake Bay, believed to be better land for farming and defense. Instead, whether due to navigational choices or the stubbornness of the ship's pilot, Simon Fernandez, they were deposited once again at Roanoke Island. To many colonists, it must have felt like being haunted by the past, a cursed ground already marked by hunger and conflict. Yet here they were, stranded, expected to make the best of it. The early months were a mixture of hope and anxiety. Homes were built, crops planted, and the fragile beginnings of community took shape. There were moments of light amid the shadows, most famously, the birth of Virginia Dare, John White's granddaughter, the first English child born in the New World. To the colonists, her birth must have felt like a blessing, a sign that perhaps God intended them to succeed. Virginia Dare's name would echo through history, a symbol of both innocence and mystery. But beneath the optimism, unease lingered. Supplies dwindled more quickly than expected, and relationships with the surrounding tribes grew tense. Some groups were hostile, remembering the violence of Lane's soldiers from the earlier expedition. Others were wary, unwilling to provide food to people who had already proven themselves unreliable allies. The colonists faced the same reality as their predecessors. The land was unforgiving, and they were unprepared. John White knew they needed help. The settlement could not endure without fresh supplies from England. In August 1587, he made the painful decision to return to England himself, leaving behind his daughter, his granddaughter, and over 100 colonists. It was a decision that must have weighed on him, like an iron chain. White was not abandoning them, at least, that was not his intent. He promised to return quickly, within months, carrying food, tools, and reinforcements. For the colonists waving him off, the image of his ship sailing over the horizon must have been both a lifeline and a wound. They trusted that he would return. They had no choice. What White could not foresee was how events in Europe would conspire against him. England was on the brink of war with Spain, and the mighty Spanish Armada was gathering. Ships were seized for defense, resources redirected toward survival. White pleaded for a return voyage, but again and again he was delayed. Months stretched into years. By the time he finally secured passage back across the Atlantic, it was 1590, 3 years since he had left Roanoke. Pause here for a moment, and imagine this. You are one of the colonists. The crops you planted have withered. The winters have been brutal. Food is scarce, and every knock at the edge of the settlement could be friend or foe. Each sunrise, you look to the ocean, waiting for sails that never appear. Days become weeks, weeks become years. How long do you wait before hope breaks into despair? And while you're imagining it, let me ask you something. Right now, as you're listening, what's the time where you are? Where are you watching from? Think about that for a moment. Because the colonists at Roanoke had no way of knowing what time it truly was, whether their story was only beginning, or whether the end had already arrived. When White finally returned in 1590, his heart must have been torn between dread and anticipation. He imagined his daughter running to greet him, his granddaughter grown into a child of 3 years, voices calling out in relief as supplies at last arrived. Instead, what he found was silence. The settlement was deserted. Houses had been dismantled, belongings scattered, but there were no bodies, no graves, no signs of violence. Only a single word carved into a post. CROATOAN. That word would echo through history as one of the greatest riddles of the New World. White searched, desperate, but storms and dwindling provisions forced him back to sea before he could investigate further. He never saw his daughter, his granddaughter, or the colonists again. Thus began the great mystery. The first English community in the New World had vanished, leaving behind only a trace carved in wood. Were they alive, living somewhere else? Were they dead, lost to hunger, conflict, or the wilderness itself? No one knew then, and no one knows for certain now. What we do know is this. The dream of a permanent English settlement at Roanoke had dissolved into air. What remained was not just a historical footnote, but a ghost story that still lingers in the American imagination. And John White, the man who had hoped to lead his people into the future, returned home broken, haunted by the silence of the colony that bore his name. When John White set sail for England in 1587, he believed he would be back within months. A quick turnaround, a replenishing of supplies, and the fragile settlement at Roanoke would be secure. But history, as so often happens, had other plans. The England White returned to was a country on the brink of catastrophe. Spain's power loomed large across Europe, and word spread of a massive fleet, the Spanish Armada, preparing to invade. The Queen could not afford weakness. Every seaworthy ship was seized, every sailor conscripted into national defense. Colonization, however noble or ambitious, meant nothing if England itself fell to Spain. White's pleas for resources were drowned out by the demands of war. He tried. Again and again, White begged Raleigh, pleaded with officials, and sought passage on any vessel willing to sail across the Atlantic. But months dragged into years. His family and fellow colonists remained stranded, trapped on the edge of a hostile wilderness, waiting for a ship that never came. He must have pictured them daily, his daughter Eleanor, his infant granddaughter Virginia Dare, the other families clinging to hope. He had promised them he would return, and yet he was powerless to keep that promise. The delay was not merely unfortunate, it was fatal. Colonies survive on supply chains, on a steady rhythm of goods and communication across the sea. Without resupply, crops fail, tools break, medicine runs out. Worse still, morale collapses. The colonists at Roanoke were not soldiers hardened to hardship. They were farmers, artisans, mothers, and children. Their survival depended on timing, and time had abandoned them. Meanwhile, in England, Raleigh's fortunes began to wane. Once the favoured courtier of Queen Elizabeth, his reputation was now tarnished by failure and whispers of disloyalty. Though he still supported White's pleas, Raleigh's influence could not compete with the urgency of war. To many at court, the colony at Roanoke was a distraction, an experiment that had already cost too much and promised too little in return. Finally, in 1590, White secured passage aboard a privateering expedition. The mission's real purpose was to raid Spanish holdings, but White convinced the captains to divert briefly to Roanoke. After 3 long years, he was coming back. Picture the voyage, White standing at the rail, the Atlantic stretching endlessly around him, haunted by visions of what he might find. Did the colonists survive? Had they built homes and fields, endured the winters, and made peace with their neighbors, or had hunger and despair consumed them? Every wave carried both hope and dread. When the fleet finally reached Roanoke Island, White's anticipation turned to unease. No smoke rose from chimneys. No voices echoed from the settlement. As the party rowed ashore, silence hung heavy over the abandoned colony. The homes had been dismantled. the palisades weathered, the belongings scattered. But there were no signs of struggle, no bones bleaching in the sun. It was as though the people had walked away quietly, deliberately. The only clue was the carving, on a post. 5 letters, CROATOAN. On a nearby tree, another carving, CRO. White knew what it meant, or at least, he thought he did. CROATOAN was the name of a nearby island today known as Hatteras Island, home to a group of native allies. Before leaving, he had instructed the colonists that if they ever relocated, they should leave behind a clear sign. If they were in distress, they were to carve a Maltese cross alongside their message. The absence of the cross suggested they had moved willingly, perhaps to seek refuge with the CROATOAN people. Relief surged through White. They were not gone, they had merely moved. His family was still alive. But fate was not done with him. As White and the sailors prepared to sail south toward CROATOAN, a sudden storm lashed the coast. The seas grew violent, battering the small ships, threatening to wreck them against the shoals. Supplies were low, tempers frayed, and the captains, whose true mission was plunder and profit, refused to risk further delay. White begged, pleaded to press on just a little farther, but the decision was made. They turned away, abandoning the search. It was the cruelest twist imaginable. White had crossed an ocean to rescue his family, and found himself within sight of their possible refuge. Yet the sea, politics and human will conspired against him. He would never set foot on CROATOAN Island, never discover the fate of his daughter or granddaughter. He returned to England, broken, haunted by silence. The tragedy of the delayed supply run is not just a story of logistics. It is a story of promises broken by circumstance. If White had returned within months, the colony might have survived. If war had not intervened, if storms had not risen, if greed had not outweighed compassion, history might have remembered Roanoke as a birthplace, not a graveyard. Instead, the 3-year delay transformed Roanoke into a mystery. When the colony needed help most, England looked inward, consumed by its own battles, and when White finally returned, he was too late. The fate of the colonists slipped into the shadows, replaced by rumor, speculation, and legend. Were they living still, hidden among allies? Were they dead, their bones lost to time? The truth had slipped away, carried by the winds of the Atlantic. This is where the story of Roanoke becomes more than history. It becomes myth, a riddle whispered across centuries, and it begins here, with the supply run that took too long, with the man who tried to save his people but could never reach them in time. The morning was grey when John White first stepped ashore in 1590. The surf slapped against the sand, gulls cried overhead, and the small landing party moved cautiously toward what had once been the beating heart of England's foothold in the New World. White's heart must have pounded in his chest. For 3 long years he had imagined this moment. Would he hear the laughter of children, the hammer of carpenters, the welcome of voices that had waited far too long? Instead, there was only silence. The palisade still stood, though weather-beaten and worn. The houses remained in place, but they were roofless, stripped, and eerily hollow. Furniture was overturned, tools abandoned. Chests had been rifled through, but not with the chaos of looters, rather with the deliberation of people who had taken what they needed and left the rest behind. It was not a battlefield. It was not a graveyard. It was a ghost town. White's eyes scanned every corner, desperate for signs of life. He called out names, his voice cracking as it echoed against the trees, but no answer came. The settlement that should have bustled with more than 100 men, women and children stood empty, abandoned as though time itself had stopped. The one clue, the word CROATOAN, carved into a post, offered direction, but no explanation. On another tree, the shorter carving CRO. White knew this meant CROATOAN Island, the home of native allies not far from Roanoke. He clung to hope. Perhaps the colonists had simply relocated. Perhaps his daughter Eleanor and his granddaughter Virginia Dare were alive, waiting for him. But every detail within the abandoned settlement carried unease. The fortifications were intact, yet there was no sign of struggle, no hastily dug graves, no evidence of slaughter, no weapons lying scattered on the ground. It was as if the people had melted into the forest, leaving behind only whispers. The gardens were overgrown, the wells choked with leaves. Time had passed here, enough time for nature to reclaim the edges of human effort. White found personal items that tore at his heart. Chests belonging to families had been broken open, some valuables still inside, as if wealth meant nothing to those who fled. His own belongings, buried before his departure, had been dug up and scattered, It was not the work of enemies. This was deliberate, methodical, and strange. The colonists had prepared for departure, but departure to where? Imagine walking through a place that should have been alive with sound, only to find it frozen in a tableau of absence. Imagine the weight of questions pressing on White's shoulders. Had they starved? Had they sought refuge with allies? Had they been attacked elsewhere, far from here? Every unanswered question sharpened the silence into something unbearable. The settlers had agreed on a signal before White left in 1587. If they were forced to abandon the colony in distress, they would carve a Maltese cross near their message. No cross was found. That detail gave White hope. It suggested the move had not been violent, not forced. Still, the absence of people, of voices, of even a single sign of life gnawed at him. The men with White searched the surrounding woods, calling out, listening for the crack of twigs or the flutter of movement. But the forest gave nothing. It stood, as it always had, ancient and indifferent. Nightfall came, and the party retreated, their torches throwing long shadows against the hollow buildings. In the dark, the silence grew heavier, the mystery deeper. For White, the pain was personal. His daughter, Eleanor, had given birth to Virginia Dare in this very settlement, the first English child born in the New World. Where were they now? Had Virginia survived to become a young girl learning to walk and speak in the wilderness, or had she perished quietly, her story ending before it began? These were not abstract questions to him. They were his family, his blood, his heart, and yet the silence gave no answer. The storm that prevented further search only deepened the agony. White had planned to sail to CROATOAN Island, to follow the message carved into the wood, but the tempest battered the coast. The expedition's captains grew restless, and resources dwindled. Against his will, White was forced to turn back, leaving Roanoke and the fate of its people forever unresolved. The emptiness of that settlement marked a turning point in history. It transformed Roanoke from a struggling colony into a legend. The image of abandoned homes, of a word carved into wood, of silence where voices should have been, has haunted generations since. Think of it this way. History often leaves us ruins, broken stones and skeletal remains to tell its stories, but Roanoke left almost nothing. No graves, no relics of battle, just an absence so complete that it became louder than any discovery. In that absence, imagination took over. Theories would swirl, stories would multiply, and the truth would slip further into shadow. For White, there was no closure. He returned to England with his heart broken, burdened with the knowledge that he had seen but not saved. For the colonists, their story was swallowed by the land, the sea, and time itself. For us, centuries later, all that remains is the image of an empty settlement, an image that refuses to fade. And so, the Lost Colony of Roanoke was born, not in its founding, but in its vanishing. A community built with hope, erased without explanation, leaving behind only the silence of unanswered questions. Among all the details of Roanoke's disappearance, one stands above the rest. Not the abandoned houses, not the missing tools, not even the absence of graves. It was the carving, 5 simple letters etched into a post, CROATOAN. It is one of the most famous words in American history, both ordinary and extraordinary. On the surface it was a clue, a direction. CROATOAN was the name of a nearby island, home to the Croatan people, allies who had interacted with the English in earlier voyages. The colonists had agreed with John White before his departure. If they relocated, they would carve their destination into a post or tree. If they were under duress, they would add a Maltese cross. No cross was present. For White, this should have been reassuring. It suggested the colonists had left willingly, perhaps seeking refuge among friends. His heart must have lifted in those first moments, imagining his daughter and granddaughter safe among the Croatan, waiting for him to arrive. He wanted desperately to follow the clue, to sail south and find them. But the storm that swept in, combined with the impatience of the privateers he sailed with, denied him that chance. The word remained, unanswered, unexplored. And so CROATOAN transformed from a clue into a legend. To the colonists, it may have been practical. They had no paper, no means of sending messages across the sea. A carved word was communication in its rawest form. But to the generations who came after, the word became something else entirely, a symbol of absence, a puzzle with too many missing pieces. Why carve only the name? Why not carve an explanation? Why not leave behind more detail? A direction, a sign of numbers, a symbol of survival. The simplicity of the message only deepened the mystery. Later writers, hungry for intrigue, would mythologize it further. Some claimed the word was cursed, tied to omens and superstition. Edgar Allan Poe is said to have whispered the word on his deathbed, though that story is likely apocryphal. In popular imagination, CROATOAN became less a clue and more a ghostly signature, a reminder that some mysteries are not meant to be solved. But to understand its meaning, we must step back to the context of 1587. The colonists were desperate. Supplies had run low, their leader had left, and storms and uncertainty had plagued their every effort. Seeking shelter among the Croatan people would have been a rational choice. The Croatan were familiar, sometimes friendly, and survival may have depended on such an alliance. The carving may simply have been a breadcrumb trail, a signal meant to lead White and his rescuers to their new home. Yet the trail was never followed. The storm that drove White away erased the possibility of immediate discovery. By the time future expeditions ventured back, the colony had vanished into deeper obscurity. The Croatan people themselves, facing their own struggles with disease and shifting alliances, left little trace of any absorption of the colonists. Oral traditions were vague, archaeological evidence scarce. The clue stood alone, detached from the people it was meant to save. Think of it as a door half open, leading into darkness. The colonists may have carved the word with hope that someone someday would follow. Instead, it became a doorway into myth, never fully opened, never fully closed. Theories multiplied. Some argued the colonists had indeed joined the Croatan, intermarrying, vanishing into a new cultural identity. Others insisted the word was a distraction, perhaps carved under duress, pointing in a false direction. Still others believed it was a mark of desperation, the last act of people who knew they would not survive. In the centuries since, the word has become something larger than life. It has been etched into novels, whispered in ghost stories, and studied by archaeologists with the fervor of treasure hunters. Each time it reappears, it carries the same haunting weight, the last known sign of over 100 souls who vanished without a trace. Imagine standing where White stood, his hand tracing the letters in the weathered wood. For him, it was not legend, it was not myth, it was a message from his daughter, from his granddaughter, from the people he had sworn to protect. It was hope, fragile and fleeting, carved into wood, and yet that hope slipped away as the storm dragged him back to sea. He would never know if the carving was a promise of survival, or a farewell written in silence. History often reduces mysteries to facts and speculation, but Roanoke resists such simplicity. CROATOAN is both fact and ghost, both evidence and absence. It is the riddle written in plain sight, a word that refuses to explain itself. Even today, historians debate its meaning. Was it a straightforward signal of relocation? Was it part of a longer message now lost to time? Or was it, perhaps, a desperate attempt to cling to a plan that had already failed? The truth may never be known. But one thing is certain, in that carving lies the weight of every unanswered question. The word stands as the last breath of a colony, the final whisper of a community swallowed by time. And so, what should have been the solution to the mystery became its heart. Without the carving, the story of Roanoke might have been forgotten, just another failed attempt at colonization. But with it, the story lingers, pulsing with suspense, echoing with absence. CROATOAN, a word carved in wood, a word carved in history, a word carved into the silence of the New World. For centuries, one theory has offered both comfort and complexity. The idea that the lost colony never truly vanished, but instead was absorbed into the lives of the indigenous people of the Carolina coast. On the surface, it is the most plausible explanation. The colonists were starving, isolated, and abandoned. They had allies nearby. The carving CROATOAN pointed toward them. Survival may have been less about mystery and more about necessity. Consider the Croatan people themselves, later known as the Hatterers. They had interacted with English explorers before, trading food and knowledge of the land. Relations were not always easy, but they were less hostile than with other tribes. If the colonists sought shelter, it would have been here. Intermarriage, shared labor, and cultural blending could have offered the English a lifeline, a way to endure after their supply chain with England collapsed. There are stories, scattered, second-hand, sometimes contradictory, that suggest this very thing. Early European explorers in later decades reported seeing native people with lighter skin, grey eyes, or English words on their tongues. John Lawson, writing in 1701, described the Hatterers as claiming some of their ancestors had been white people who could talk in a book. a reference to literacy. For many, this was tantalizing evidence, a suggestion that the colonists had lived on, transformed but not destroyed. Imagine it. Eleanor Dare teaching her daughter Virginia words in English by the fire, while Croatan children taught them the rhythms of survival in the coastal wilderness. Imagine men who once carried muskets learning to fish and hunt with native tools, their English ways fading as they adapted to their new world. Survival would not have been glamorous, but it would have been life, and perhaps for a time it was enough. But assimilation was not limited to the Croatan. Other tribes, like the Chesapeake or Roanoke, may have also played a role. Colonial records suggest some groups were suspected of harboring English survivors. Rumors circulated for decades. Settlers claimed to see white Indians in distant villages, or to hear fragments of English prayers spoken among native chants. None of these reports were ever confirmed, but their persistence kept the theory alive. The strength of this theory lies not only in possibility but in logic. For the colonists, there were only a handful of choices: starve, fight, or adapt. Starvation was inevitable if they remained isolated. Fighting would lead to destruction. Adaptation, merging with local peoples, was the only viable path forward, and yet history leaves no clear record of whether this adaptation succeeded or failed. Archaeologists have searched for evidence. Pottery fragments, weapon tips, and curious artifacts have been unearthed on Hatteras Island, some suggesting European influence in native communities. One excavation revealed items that may have belonged to colonists: a ring, a hilt of a sword, bits of copper and glass. But artifacts alone tell incomplete stories. Were they traded? Were they scavenged? Or did they once belong to colonists who lived and died among the Croatan? The line between evidence and interpretation is razor thin. There is also the question of disappearance. If assimilation happened, why did no clear descendants claim the identity of the English settlers? Disease may provide part of the answer. European pathogens devastated native populations across the Americas, often wiping out entire communities. If the colonists joined the Croatan or other tribes, they may have shared the same fate, consumed by waves of sickness that erased both native and foreign lives alike. Their identity may have simply dissolved, lost in the tides of history. Still, the theory of survival carries a strange pull. It is less final, less brutal than imagining slaughter or starvation. It allows us to believe the colonists lived, that their children grew, that their bloodlines continued unseen. Even today, families in the region sometimes claim descent from the Lost Colony, pointing to old family stories or peculiar features as proof. The truth of these claims is difficult to prove, but the persistence of belief suggests the mystery lives on in more than just records and ruins. For John White, had he known this theory, it might have been a comfort to think of his daughter and granddaughter not as ghosts but as survivors, living among new kin. Perhaps they thrived in ways he could not imagine, building lives that blended English dreams with native resilience. Yet for White, who never followed the trail to CROATOAN, the possibility was denied. He died, never knowing whether his family lived on or perished. The idea of assimilation also reshapes the way we think of Roanoke. Instead of a vanished colony, it becomes a story of transformation, a failure of empire. Yes, but not necessarily a failure of humanity. The colonists may not have built the English stronghold Rowley envisioned, but they may have found another way to endure, quietly, anonymously, among people who already knew how to survive the land. In that sense, the mystery is not just about disappearance, but about identity. Who were the Roanoke colonists in the end? English settlers, survivors turned wanderers, or the ancestors of new communities, hidden in plain sight, their story woven into a different heritage? This theory leaves us with hope, but also with questions. Assimilation explains survival but not silence. If they lived on, why was there no further contact, no clear line of descent recorded in history? Did they lose the will or the ability to reclaim their Englishness? Or did they choose not to, preferring the life they found over the life they left? The answer may never be known, but the theory of assimilation stands as one of the most enduring possibilities, that the colonists of Roanoke were not lost at all, but reborn, their fate written not in stone or wood, but in the hidden lives of those who came after. Not all theories about Roanoke end with survival. For many historians, the possibility that the colonists were met with violence is the most sobering, and, in some ways, the most likely. In a land marked by tension, mistrust, and scarcity, peace was fragile. The English settlers were strangers on indigenous ground, and the memory of bloodshed from the first failed colony under Ralph Lane lingered like a wound that had never healed. When White departed in 1587, he left behind a settlement already surrounded by uncertainty. Supplies were dwindling, neighboring tribes were divided, some cautiously cooperative, others openly hostile. The colonists had no reinforcements, no strong military protection, and no guarantee that the fragile alliances Raleigh's men had tried to forge would hold. In such a climate, the odds of violent conflict were high. Several tribes may have had motive. The CROATOAN, for instance, had been among those attacked by Lane's men in 1586. Resentment did not vanish in a year's time. If anything, the return of English settlers, this time with families and children, might have been seen as a threat, a permanent occupation of their land. Attacking the colony would not have been mere revenge. It would have been survival. Some accounts from later colonists hint at this possibility. Reports circulated that tribes in the region had boasted of wiping out the English. John Smith of Jamestown claimed to have heard rumors of survivors being captured or killed. Other reports suggested that some colonists were taken prisoner, scattered among different villages, their fate sealed in silence. These stories were second-hand, unreliable, often tangled with fear and propaganda, but they were not easily dismissed. Archaeological evidence has added fragments to this grim theory. Excavations at Roanoke and surrounding areas have revealed signs of struggle, burned structures, broken tools, and artifacts that suggest sudden abandonment. Some historians argue these could indicate conflict. Yet, like so much of Roanoke's story, the evidence is too thin, too ambiguous to confirm. Consider the mindset of the colonists. Isolated, weakened by hunger, and desperate for allies, they would have been vulnerable. A coordinated attack, even by a small force, could have scattered them. Without White to lead, or England to support them, they may have been easy prey. Violence may not have come all at once. It may have been gradual, a series of raids, kidnappings and killings that wore the colony down until nothing remained. There is also the possibility of betrayal. Not all indigenous groups were united, and some may have used the English as pawns in larger conflicts. A tribe threatened by rivals could have struck first, eliminating the colonists before they became a weapon in enemy hands. In such a context, the English were not settlers but chess pieces, and their disappearance may have been part of a game of survival that left no witnesses. One particularly chilling theory suggests the colonists were wiped out, not at Roanoke itself, but after relocating. If they followed the path suggested by the carving CROATOAN, they may have met their end elsewhere. The Chesapeake Bay region, another potential relocation site, was known for its violent clashes between tribes. Some accounts claim the Powhatan later boasted of destroying a group of Europeans who had settled nearby, though whether these were Roanoke survivors remains uncertain. The fate of Virginia Dare, the infant born in the colony, became a focal point of such dark speculation. Some stories, half legend, half rumor, suggest she grew into a young woman among native tribes, only to meet a tragic end. Others transform her into a figure of folklore, the White Doe, a spirit said to wander the forests of North Carolina. While these tales cannot be taken as evidence, they reflect the way Roanoke's disappearance seeped into the cultural imagination, blending history with myth. What makes the theory of violence so haunting is its silence. A massacre leaves traces, bodies, weapons, blood. Yet at Roanoke, no such evidence was ever found. If violence occurred, it was thorough, erasing not only lives but every sign of their end. Was it careful concealment? Or did the wilderness itself swallow the evidence, as it swallows everything given enough time? For John White, the absence of bodies may have offered fleeting hope, but it also deepened the torment. Better perhaps to imagine his family alive among allies, than to picture them slaughtered in the woods. But history is not built on hope alone. In a land of scarcity and mistrust, violence was not just possible, it was probable. And yet, we hesitate to accept this theory fully. Perhaps it is because imagining survival, even assimilation, offers a kind of closure, a sense that the colonists' story did not end in terror. Violence offers no such comfort. It reduces the lost colony to victims, their dream extinguished not by mystery but by blood. Still, to ignore the possibility is to ignore the realities of the time. Colonization was not a peaceful act. It was intrusion, often met with resistance. For every settlement that thrived, others were destroyed. Roanoke may simply have been one of many, lost not to legend, but to conflict. In the end, the theory of violence leaves us with the darkest question of all. If the colonists were killed, who remembers them? Whose stories did they vanish into, unrecorded, unspoken, erased by the very land they sought to claim? That silence, The absence of voices, of graves, of truth, is what keeps Roanoke alive in our imagination. For all the speculation, legends and rumors, the truth of Roanoke's fate may lie beneath the soil. Archaeologists have been chasing the mystery for centuries, spades and trowels replacing quills and rumor, each discovery a whisper from the past. Yet the earth has yielded fragments, not answers, pieces of a puzzle too scattered to complete. The first real efforts to uncover Roanoke's story began long after the colony's disappearance. For decades, interest was fueled less by science than by folklore. Families claimed descent from the colonists, while ghostly stories of Virginia Dare drifted through southern oral tradition. But in the 20th century, archaeologists began serious investigations, hoping to turn myth into evidence. At Roanoke Island itself, excavations revealed foundations of the original fort and settlement. Artifacts, bits of pottery, tools and weapons, spoke of English presence, but nothing indicated what had happened after John White's fateful return. No graves, no mass burials, no clear evidence of departure. The soil seemed determined to keep its silence. Attention turned to Hatteras Island, once known as CROATOAN. If the colonists had indeed followed the carving, they might have left traces there. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, archaeologists uncovered European items at the site, fragments of wrought iron, copper and glass. Some objects clearly belonged to the 16th century, others seemed to come from later trade. Could these be remnants of Roanoke's colonists, folded into the daily lives of the CROATOAN people, or were they simply goods exchanged in trade networks that stretched across tribes and continents? One discovery in particular sparked fascination. A signet ring unearthed in 1998. The brass ring bore a lion crest, leading some to believe it once belonged to an English colonist. Headlines declared it the smoking gun of Roanoke's survival, but later analysis revealed the ring was likely a cheap trinket, mass-produced in Europe, possibly dating to a later period. What once seemed like proof faded back into ambiguity. Another tantalizing clue came not from soil but from ink. In 2012, researchers studying John White's original maps noticed two patches of paper covering small areas. When examined under light, they revealed symbols, one resembling a fort on the mainland near Albemarle Sound. Some historians theorize this could have been a planned relocation site for the colonists, perhaps even the CRO carving's intended direction. But maps are as uncertain as the earth itself, and no excavation has yet confirmed such a settlement. The search has not been limited to Roanoke and Hatteras. Archaeologists have scoured coastal North Carolina, seeking traces of Europeans among native settlements. At a site called Site X near the Chowan River, a handful of artifacts emerged. A gunlock, pieces of slate, European pottery. To some this suggested a splinter group of colonists may have lived or died there. To others, the finds were simply evidence of trade. Once again, the line between contact and survival blurred. The challenge lies in interpretation. In the 16th and 17th centuries, European goods traveled quickly through native trade networks. A shard of pottery found hundreds of miles inland may not mean English colonists lived there. It may only mean their belongings did. Without human remains, without clear settlement patterns, archaeologists tread a thin line between fact and hope. Yet even fragments tell stories. The scattered evidence paints a picture of colonists who did not vanish in a single moment, but were instead dispersed, their presence absorbed into other narratives. Whether they joined the CROATOAN, split into smaller groups, or were captured by rivals, the artifacts suggest continuity, not abrupt erasure. They hint that the colonists lived on, in some form, long enough to leave traces that centuries later still spark debate. But archaeology also confronts us with limits. Soil erodes, wood decays, and the coastal environment is particularly unforgiving. Hurricanes, shifting sands and rising seas may have erased entire chapters of the colony's story. What remains may only be fragments, never the full text. Still, the allure of discovery persists. Each artifact unearthed, no matter how small, becomes a beacon of possibility. A shard of pottery becomes a child's meal. A copper bead becomes a trade between strangers. A rusted tool becomes the handprint of survival. And yet, none of them answer the central question, where did the people go? The search itself has become part of the legend. Each new dig is met with headlines, each find hailed as potential proof, each disappointment swallowed by the larger mystery. Roanoke resists closure. It offers only glimpses as if the past itself conspires to keep its secret. In this way, the archaeological record mirrors the colony itself, incomplete, fragile, and suspended between presence and absence. We know they were here. We do not know where they went. The earth has spoken in whispers, but it has never told us the ending. And perhaps that is why the mystery endures. If the soil revealed all, if bones and settlements told the full tale, Roanoke would be a chapter closed. Instead, it remains a question mark carved into the land itself, a riddle that tempts us with fragments but denies us certainty. Archaeology, at its best, is a conversation with the dead. At Roanoke, it is a conversation interrupted, half-finished, drowned by time. Yet with every shovel of earth, every artifact held to the light, we come closer to touching the edges of their story, not solving it, perhaps, but honoring it. The clues are there, scattered like breadcrumbs. Whether they lead to survival, assimilation, or destruction is a trail we still follow. Centuries after the last colonist walked away from the empty palisade. When you strip away the theories, the artifacts, and the speculation, one question remains: why does the story of Roanoke endure? Countless settlements in the New World failed. Colonists starved, were driven out, or abandoned their posts. Yet Roanoke is the one we remember, the one that lingers like a whisper in the American imagination. The reason lies not only in what happened, but in what we can never know. Mysteries have a way of burrowing deeper into memory than facts. A colony that simply starved and left graves would be tragic, but it would not echo across 4 centuries. Roanoke's silence is its power. Over 100 men, women and children vanished without a trace, leaving behind only a single carved word. That emptiness, that absence, invites us to fill it with our own fears and hopes. We are haunted because we can see ourselves in them. These were not soldiers of fortune alone, but families. Mothers tucking children into makeshift beds, fathers building shelters against the wilderness, a grandfather sketching maps by candlelight. They dreamed of a future that would outlast them. To imagine their disappearance is to imagine the fragility of our own lives, the ease with which certainty can dissolve into air. And there is the word, CROATOAN. It has become more than a clue. It is a symbol, a cipher that refuses to decode. Every generation has interpreted it differently, as hope, as betrayal, as superstition. Writers and artists have seized it, transforming the colonists into ghostly figures, cursed wanderers, or secret survivors. Even today the word carries a weight beyond its letters, like a spell that refuses to fade. The mystery also strikes at the heart of America's origin story. Before Jamestown, before Plymouth, there was Roanoke. Had it thrived, it might have been the birthplace of English America. Instead, it vanished, leaving Jamestown to carry the mantle. In this way, Roanoke is both failure and foundation, the dream that faltered, the echo that shaped what followed. To remember it is to remember that America was not built easily, that its beginnings were fragile and uncertain. Archaeology has given us fragments, but never resolution. Theories of assimilation offer comfort, but no proof. Theories of violence offer grim plausibility, but no closure. The soil tells us only that they were here, not where they went. And in that gap, the story continues to breathe. Perhaps that is why Roanoke has seeped into popular culture so deeply. It has appeared in novels, films, television series, and ghost stories. Each retelling reshapes the colony into a mirror of the age that tells it, a tale of survival, a warning of violence, or a symbol of cultural transformation. The colonists themselves have become less people and more archetypes, lost souls wandering the edge of history. But behind the myth, there is still the human. Imagine Eleanor Dare, waiting each day for her father to return, raising her child in uncertainty. Imagine Virginia Dare, the first English child of the New World, growing from infant to toddler, perhaps even beyond, only to vanish into silence. Their stories are personal, not abstract, and it is that intimacy that binds us. Roanoke is not just a colony, it is a family lost in time. The haunting also lies in the way Roanoke refuses to be claimed. No nation, no tribe, no archive can say with certainty what happened. It belongs to no one, and to everyone, a blank page where history should have been written. That openness fuels obsession. We dig, we speculate, we invent, because the story demands an ending it will not give. And maybe, in the end, that is why it matters. Roanoke reminds us that history is not always neat, not always clear. It reminds us that the past holds secrets we may never unlock, and that sometimes the absence of answers is more powerful than the answers themselves. In the silence of Roanoke, we see the limits of knowledge, the fragility of ambition, and the persistence of mystery. As you finish this story tonight, consider what haunts you most: the possibility of survival, of families who lived on in hidden ways, the possibility of violence, of lives cut short and erased, or is it the silence itself, the refusal of history to explain? Whatever the answer, the Lost Colony of Roanoke is not just a story of the past, it is a story of us, our hunger for certainty, our fear of the unknown, our hope that somewhere, in the darkness, the voices we lost might still be waiting. And so, more than 400 years later, we still look to the coast of North Carolina, to the sands of Roanoke, and ask the same question John White must have whispered as he stared at the carved word. Where did they go? The waves that lap against the Outer Banks today carry no voices, no cries of children, no hammering of settlers shaping wood into homes. The winds that sweep across Roanoke Island no longer rustle English banners or fill the sails of ships bringing hope from across the sea. All that remains is silence, a silence that has stretched across more than 4 centuries, broken only by the word carved into wood, CROATOAN. The Lost Colony of Roanoke endures, because it is both history and myth. It began as a story of ambition, of empire building, of England staking its claim in a new world, yet it became something else entirely, a riddle, a disappearance, an absence that refuses explanation. And in that absence we find ourselves returning again and again, trying to hear voices that may never be heard. Think back to the beginning of this story, to Raleigh's dream of empire, to families packing their belongings for a dangerous voyage, to John White's promise that he would return. Think of the moment he left, his daughter Eleanor and infant granddaughter Virginia Dare standing on the shore, waving him goodbye, believing he would soon return. That image, tender and tragic, is at the heart of the mystery. It is not simply about politics or empire, it is about family. And when White returned, years too late, he found not death, but absence. That is what makes Roanoke so haunting. Had he discovered bodies, the tragedy would have been brutal, but clear. Had he found survivors, it would have been triumphant. Instead, he found a settlement intact, houses dismantled, tools scattered, belongings rifled, and no sign of where the people had gone. No graves, no battle, no answers. Just silence. That silence has been filled with theories. Some believe the colonists starved, reduced to desperation, perhaps scattering into the forest in search of food, perishing one by one until none remained. Others see the word CROATOAN as evidence of survival, a relocation to Hatteras Island, where they may have been absorbed into the Croatan people. Oral traditions, faint and scattered, suggest descendants with grey eyes and English words on their tongues. Archaeology offers fragments, a ring, a shard of pottery, tools buried in the soil, but fragments are not certainty. And then there is the darker possibility that the colonists met their end in violence, victims of mistrust and vengeance. The memory of earlier English attacks lingered among the tribes. Resentment may have turned to action, wiping out the fragile settlement before it could take root. Later reports hint at survivors scattered among hostile groups, enslaved or killed, their stories erased by silence. But these too are rumors, impossible to prove. Theories abound, but evidence is scarce, and perhaps that is why Roanoke grips us more tightly than other failures. The mystery is not solved, and may never be. It belongs to that rare category of history, where absence is louder than fact, where imagination is forced to fill the gaps. Each new discovery, a shard, a carving, a line in a map, promises resolution but delivers only more questions. And yet, maybe Roanoke's power is not in its solution but in its refusal to be solved. It stands as a mirror of human ambition. The colonists dreamed of permanence, of building a home that would stand against time. Instead, they became ghosts. In their failure, they remind us of how fragile survival can be, how easily dreams can collapse under hunger, war, or neglect. Roanoke was not the birth of English America. Jamestown would take that mantle years later, but it was the shadow that haunted it, a reminder that success was never guaranteed. For John White, the silence must have been unbearable. Imagine his torment as he sailed away for the last time, storms preventing him from reaching CROATOAN, knowing he might be abandoning his family forever. He died, never knowing what became of them, carrying the weight of unanswered questions to his grave. In that sense, White was the first victim of Roanoke's legend, a man condemned to wonder. But so are we. Centuries later, we still wonder. Where did they go? Did Virginia Dare live beyond infancy, growing into a young woman in a world her grandfather never saw? Did Eleanor dare raise her child among strangers, teaching her English words while learning the songs of another people? Or were they erased, their lives cut short, their stories silenced before they could take root? These questions matter because they remind us that history is not just dates and charters. It is lives. Fragile, fleeting, easily forgotten. The colonists of Roanoke were people like us, bound by hope, fear, and love. Their disappearance is haunting because it could have been anyone's. It is not the mystery of ghosts, but the mystery of people who walked into history and never returned. And that, perhaps, is the true legacy of Roanoke. It is not about the fate of one colony, but about the limits of what we can know. In the silence of Roanoke, we hear the echo of every life erased by time, every story lost, every voice we will never hear again. It is a reminder that history is not complete, that some pages are missing, and that we are left to imagine the words that should have been written there. The lost colony still haunts us because it is unfinished. It lingers at the edge of knowledge, daring us to search, to dig, to speculate, even as it slips further from our grasp. It is both tragedy and legend, absence and presence, silence and echo, and perhaps that is why, more than 400 years later, we still tell the story. The waves still strike the sand, the winds still sweep through the trees, the silence remains. And somewhere in that silence, the voices of the lost colony linger, waiting for answers that may never come. So we ask again, as John White did, as every generation since has done, where did they go?